Good evening, brave souls. I'm Grim, and tonight I'll be your companion through the shadows. Together, we'll dive into stories that grow darker with every whisper. So, get comfortable if you're ready. The night is only just beginning. The rain fell in heavy sheets, casting an eerie glow under the headlights as Joe drove down the lonely stretch of highway. The storm was unrelenting, and each drop echoed like a drumbeat against the windshield. Just as he rounded a bend, a figure appeared on the roadside, illuminated briefly in the beams. A lone hitchhiker, drenched and looking desperate. Joe hesitated but pulled over. He couldn't leave someone out here in this weather. The man climbed in quickly, slamming the door against the storm, and muttered a quiet, "Thank you." His clothes were old, torn at the edges, and his face was shadowed beneath a low-brimmed hat. "Rough night to be walking," Joe said, trying to break the uneasy silence. The hitchhiker nodded, offering only a faint, almost chilling smile. "Sometimes the road chooses you," the man replied cryptically, his voice soft, yet carrying a weight Joe couldn't quite understand. Joe glanced sideways, feeling a chill settle in the car, despite the heater blasting. He tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the rain-slicked road ahead. But as they drove, the stranger's eyes seemed to follow him, watching with an intensity that made Joe's hands tighten on the wheel. "Headed anywhere specific?" Joe asked, trying to keep his tone light. "Wherever you're going is just fine," the man replied, his gaze never wavering. There was something off about him, a strange familiarity that Joe couldn't place, like the face of someone he'd met in a dream. The car was silent for a few miles, the only sound being the rain and the tires hissing against the wet asphalt. But soon, the hitchhiker spoke again, his voice filling the silence in a way that felt invasive. "You've done some driving tonight," he remarked, nodding to the empty coffee cups and crumpled maps on the seat beside Joe. Joe blinked, unsettled. "Yeah, long drive. And yet, still so far from home," the hitchhiker murmured, almost to himself. He turned, his eyes piercing, like he knew something Joe didn't. "Been running a long time, haven't you, Joe?" Joe's grip on the wheel tightened, heart pounding. He hadn't told the man his name. "How do you—" The hitchhiker's smile widened, a thin line of unsettling calm. "You've made mistakes, Joe. Left people behind. Thought the road would keep them at a distance, didn't you?" The air in the car felt stifling, and Joe's mind raced. This was impossible. Nobody knew about his past, about the people he'd left, the bridges he'd burned. And yet, here was this stranger, picking at his secrets, as if they were threads he could unravel at will. "Who are you?" Joe demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. But when he glanced over, the hitchhiker was silent, his expression unreadable. The rain seemed to pound harder, echoing the beat of Joe's heart as the stranger leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "You can't outrun guilt, Joe. It sticks to you no matter how fast you drive." Joe's breathing was ragged now, his hands slick with sweat. His eyes flicked to the hitchhiker, who stared straight ahead, calm as ever. He tried to keep his focus on the road, but his mind was clouded with fear and confusion. In a desperate attempt to keep calm, he shook his head, muttering, "This is crazy. I'm just tired." But the hitchhiker's voice cut through his thoughts. "Does Sarah know how you left her? Abandoned her without a word, just drove off, thinking the miles would bury it all?" Joe's heart stopped. Sarah. That name, like a ghost resurrected, had haunted him in the quiet hours. His wife, the one he'd left years ago, believing he could escape the guilt that gnawed at him. But he'd never told anyone. The name had never passed his lips since that day. What are you?" he choked out, unable to look at the hitchhiker, too afraid of what he'd see in those eyes. The man merely tilted his head, watching him with a detached curiosity. "I'm just a passenger, Joe. The one you've carried with you all along." A flash of lightning illuminated the man's face, casting deep shadows that seemed to twist his features into something dark, something otherworldly. In that instant, Joe swore he saw more than a hitchhiker. He saw every regret, every mistake, and every dark corner of his past staring back at him. Panicked, Joe swerved the car to the side of the road, slamming it into park. He turned to the hitchhiker, words caught in his throat. But the passenger's seat was empty. Joe blinked, heart racing, his gaze scanning the dark, empty seat where the hitchhiker had been just seconds ago. His mind reeled. Had he imagined it? Was it some twisted trick of exhaustion? But then his eyes fell on the passenger seat. There, carved into the leather with deep, jagged letters, was a message. "You can't outrun yourself." The words burned into his mind, each one a reminder of the guilt he'd tried to bury. He felt a shiver crawl up his spine, as if the hitchhiker's presence still lingered in the car. Joe sat there, breathing heavily, staring at the message etched into the seat. He reached out to touch the letters, feeling the rough edges where the leather had been gouged, as real and solid as the memories he'd tried to escape. As the storm raged on, Joe felt something inside him crack. A wall he'd built over the years, crumbling under the weight of his own guilt. He couldn't run anymore. He couldn't keep pretending that the past wasn't there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to catch up to him. The rain began to ease, the storm moving on as the sky lightened just slightly on the horizon. Joe put the car back into drive, hands trembling as he turned back toward the road. This time, though, he knew he couldn't just keep driving. He had a call to make, an apology long overdue. But as he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that the hitchhiker was still with him, lingering in the air like a dark cloud, a reminder of the past that had finally caught up. And when he glanced in the rearview mirror, just for a second, he saw a familiar shadow sitting in the back seat, smiling a faint, knowing smile before fading into the darkness. The sun was setting, casting an eerie orange glow across the deserted highway as Sam trudged along, thumb outstretched, hoping for a ride before darkness took over. His backpack was heavy, his feet sore, and he just wanted to reach the next town. Then, like an answer to his silent prayer, headlights appeared in the distance, followed by the sound of a slowing engine as a small blue sedan pulled up beside him. The passenger window rolled down, and a cheerful face peeked out. It was a woman with curly hair and a wide smile, maybe in her 40s. "Need a lift?" she asked in a friendly tone. Beside her, the driver, a man with a neatly trimmed beard and a baseball cap, nodded with a friendly wave. "Yeah, that'd be great. I'm headed to Red Pines," Sam replied, relieved. "Perfect. We're going that way, too. Hop in," she said, unlocking the door. Sam climbed in, sliding his backpack at his feet. The car smelled of vanilla air freshener, and a soft hum of music played in the background. "Thanks so much," he said, relaxing into the seat. "Oh, no problem at all. I'm Marge, and this is my husband, Tom," the woman said with a warm smile. "We're just happy to have some company on the drive." As they drove, Marge and Tom filled the silence with stories about their road trips, places they'd seen, and the odd people they'd met. They seemed friendly enough, and Sam felt himself easing up. He glanced out the window, watching the scenery roll by as the sky darkened. But as they continued down the highway, something began to feel off. Marge was leaning forward, asking question after question, each one a little more personal than the last. "So, Sam, you traveling alone?" she asked, her voice casual, but her eyes a bit too focused. Yeah," Sam answered hesitantly. "And no one's expecting you in Red Pines?" Tom added, keeping his eyes fixed on the road. Sam hesitated, feeling a chill prickle his skin. "No, just passing through. No one's waiting for me or anything." He tried to laugh it off, hoping to shake off his growing unease. Marge turned in her seat to face him fully. "That's good. Less complicated, you know?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. An uncomfortable silence filled the car as they passed mile after mile in the growing darkness. The music played on, a hauntingly soft tune that seemed to match the strange atmosphere. Trying to distract himself, Sam glanced at the dashboard, looking for a way to make conversation and steer it away from himself. But his eyes caught something strange. Taped to the dashboard were photos of different people, all smiling, all posing with backpacks on their shoulders. Hitchhikers, just like him. Sam felt a knot form in his stomach. "You guys pick up a lot of travelers, huh?" he asked, keeping his tone light. "Oh, we've given rides to all sorts of people," Marge replied with a grin. "People come and go so quickly, don't they, Tom?" "Yep," Tom agreed, his eyes cold in the rearview mirror. "One minute they're here, the next, gone." Sam forced a laugh, feeling his palms grow sweaty. Something was wrong. He glanced at the photos again, noticing that some of them had marks on the corners, little dates scribbled in black marker. Each photo looked more worn than the last, like they'd been there a while. He reached for his phone, but Marge's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist. "No phones," she said, her grip surprisingly strong. "Just enjoy the ride." Sam's heart pounded as he nodded, too afraid to argue. He could feel her watching him, her eyes never leaving his face. He knew then that he needed to get out of the car. Soon. "Hey, do you mind if I take a little break?" Sam asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I left my water bottle back there, and I'm dying of thirst." Tom exchanged a look with Marge. "We're in the middle of nowhere, Sam. Probably best to stay put," he said, his voice dropping to an eerie calm. Panic surged through Sam as he realized that they weren't planning to let him out. He thought about throwing open the door, jumping out, and making a run for it. But before he could act, Marge's voice cut through the silence again. "You know, Sam, we've been following you for miles," she said softly, her tone almost affectionate. "Watching you walk, seeing how tired you looked." Sam's throat tightened. "Why?" "Because we knew you'd be alone," she replied, her smile widening. "Out here, no one hears anything. No one sees. Isn't that right, Tom?" "That's right," Tom echoed, a chilling satisfaction in his voice. Sam's heart raced. He took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "I think I'll walk from here," he said firmly, reaching for the door handle. But the door wouldn't budge. Marge chuckled, shaking her head. "Doors are locked, Sam. We wouldn't want you falling out. Besides, we're not done with our conversation." Desperation clawed at him. "Please, let me out," he pleaded, his voice shaking. Tom and Marge exchanged another look, and in that moment, Sam saw the change in their faces. The masks of kindness slipping, replaced by something darker, something predatory. "Sam," Tom said, his voice low and menacing, "we've been giving rides to people like you for a long time, and they never get to Red Pines. They're always detoured." Sam felt his pulse hammering in his ears, his mind racing for a way out. He had to think fast. There had to be something, some way to escape. As they approached a sharp curve, an idea struck him. "Hey, look!" Sam shouted, pointing wildly out the window. Tom and Marge glanced in the direction he pointed, just long enough for Sam to grab his backpack and swing it at Marge, hitting her hard enough to make her gasp and loosen her grip on him. In the moment of chaos, Sam reached across the seat and pulled the emergency brake, sending the car skidding to a violent halt on the shoulder. He wrenched open the door, scrambling out as fast as he could and sprinting down the highway, adrenaline flooding his veins. Behind him, he heard Marge scream, "Get back here!" But he didn't look back. He kept running, lungs burning, as he darted off the road and into the dark cover of the trees. He ran until he could no longer hear the car, until his legs ached and his breath came in sharp, painful gasps. Only then did he slow, glancing over his shoulder to make sure they hadn't followed. The night was silent, save for the distant sound of a car engine fading into the darkness. Sam leaned against a tree, chest heaving, as he realized he had narrowly escaped something terrible, something that would haunt him forever. The faces of the other hitchhikers on those photos flashed in his mind, their smiles frozen in time. Sam knew he was lucky to have gotten away, but he also knew he would never forget that night, and he would never, ever hitchhike again. Rain poured down like sheets, drenching Liam as he staggered through the dark forest. His car had broken down miles back, and he'd taken a wrong turn, ending up in the middle of nowhere with night settling around him. Just as the cold seeped into his bones, he spotted the faint outline of a cabin nestled between the trees. With nowhere else to go, he headed toward it, praying it would be empty. He reached the cabin and found the door unlocked. Pushing it open, he was greeted by the smell of damp wood and dust. Inside, the furniture was sparse, a single table, a dusty sofa, and a fireplace with old ashes scattered at the bottom. It looked like no one had been there for ages, which gave him some relief. At least he'd be alone for the night. He closed the door behind him, took off his soaked jacket, and slumped onto the sofa, exhausted. But as soon as he settled in, he heard a soft sound, a whisper, almost too quiet to catch. He sat up, his heart thumping. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing in the empty cabin. Silence answered him, broken only by the patter of rain on the roof. He shook his head, convincing himself it was his imagination. Feeling drained, Liam laid back down, hoping sleep would come fast. But just as his eyes began to close, he heard it again. This time, it was clearer. A faint shuffle, like footsteps brushing over old wooden floors. He sat up, peering into the dark corners of the room, but there was no one there. Swallowing his nerves, he decided to check the rest of the cabin. He crept into the next room, which looked like a bedroom with an old bed and a single chair. Everything was coated in a layer of dust. As he turned to leave, his gaze fell on a small piece of paper lying on the bed. Hesitating, he picked it up and read the shaky handwriting. "I see you." Liam's heart skipped a beat. His eyes darted around the room, but he was still alone. Trying to stay calm, he told himself it had to be some kind of old prank, left by someone who'd passed through long ago. He shoved the note into his pocket and returned to the main room, trying to shake off the feeling that he was being watched. But the night was only beginning. Hours passed, and Liam lay awake, every creak of the cabin making him flinch. The rain continued, but beneath it, he thought he could hear the soft whispering again. It was closer now, just outside the door. He held his breath, listening, as the whisper turned into a faint tapping on the cabin walls, moving from one side to the other. He tried to convince himself it was just the wind, or maybe branches brushing against the wood. But then, just as he began to relax, a loud knock echoed from the door. Liam froze, his heart pounding. Who would be out there in a storm like this? He waited, his body tense, but the knock didn't come again. Cautiously, he stood up and moved toward the door, pressing his ear against it. Silence. Slowly, he unlocked it and pulled it open, peering out into the rain. There was no one there, just the dark forest, and the sound of rain hitting the ground. Feeling a mix of relief and confusion, he shut the door and locked it again. But as he turned, his blood ran cold. Another note lay on the table, one that hadn't been there a minute ago. "You shouldn't be here." His hands shook as he picked up the note, eyes scanning the room. How could someone have left it without him seeing? He checked every corner, behind the sofa, under the table, nothing. He was alone, yet every instinct told him that someone was watching him. Desperate to escape the eerie cabin, he tried his phone, hoping for a signal to call for help. But the screen flashed, "No service." He felt trapped, with nowhere to go but back to the unsettling silence of the cabin. Time crawled by, and eventually he drifted into a restless sleep on the sofa. In his dreams, he heard the whispers again, echoing all around him, growing louder and closer until they seemed to fill his head. He jolted awake, gasping, only to find the cabin as silent as before. But then he saw it. Another note, this time lying on his chest. "Leave before it's too late." He scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He wanted to leave, but the storm outside was relentless, and he had no idea which way to go in the dark. All he knew was that he couldn't stay. Gathering his courage, he grabbed his wet jacket and slung his backpack over his shoulder, deciding he'd rather face the storm than whatever was in that cabin. But as he reached the door, he heard a low creak behind him. He turned slowly, and his heart nearly stopped. In the doorway of the bedroom stood a shadowy figure, half hidden in darkness. Its eyes were fixed on him, gleaming faintly in the dim light. Panic surged through him, and he backed toward the door, fumbling with the lock. But before he could open it, the figure took a step forward, and Liam's breath caught in his throat. Who are you?" he whispered, voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand and pointed toward him, the gesture slow and deliberate. Liam's skin prickled with terror, and he threw open the door, dashing out into the rain-soaked night. He ran through the forest, branches whipping his face, feet slipping in the mud. He didn't look back, terrified of what he might see if he did. The whispers followed him, carried on the wind, urging him to run faster. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he saw the faint glow of headlights up ahead. Stumbling onto the road, he waved his arms, and a car screeched to a stop. An older man rolled down the window, staring at Liam in shock. "Are you all right, son?" he asked, his voice full of concern. Liam nodded, breathless and soaked. "Please, just get me out of here," he managed to say, glancing back toward the dark woods. The man helped him into the car, and they sped off, leaving the cabin and the eerie whispers behind. As they drove, Liam felt a strange sense of relief, but a glance down at his hand made his blood turn cold. In his clenched fist was another note, damp from the rain. He unfolded it, heart hammering, as he read the single chilling sentence, "You can't escape." And as the darkness fades, remember, the real chills linger long after the stories end. Until next time, brave souls.